We're continuing our study in the Gospel of John. Last week we started John chapter 6, another hardy chapter to go through. It's difficult to how are you going to parse this up because there's so much. And so we have two signs as we look at this again, chiastic structure of signs that we've seen so far in this Gospel that John's shown us: turning water into wine, a sign of transformation; healing the son of the nobleman, a sign of restoration; a sign of jurisdiction, healing paralytic at the pool of Bethesda. And then in John 6, it opens up with this miracle of provision, this sign of provision, and how each sign really has these layers to them. The superficial, yes, that's an amazing miracle, but then also what's the deeper spiritual meaning behind this? And John again says, these signs are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And now we've hit that kind of pinnacle sign for John in this miracle of provision, and we're kind of circling back now at this structure in this another miracle of jurisdiction, the walking on water. The feeding of the 5,000, that was a miracle. It's unique in the fact that, of course, he's fed people multiple times. He's fed the 5,000, he's fed the 4,000 later on. That's unique, though, because it's the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels. The walking on water takes place in John, but also in Matthew and Mark. Luke doesn't record this one, but like we did in the previous miracle, the previous sign, we'll kind of interweave some of the things that happen in Mark and use that as filler because it's very helpful. If we just read the 5 verses today, it'd be over pretty quickly and I could fill it in, but we're going to look at a lot of different places. But I kind of want to, before I do something a little unusual and kind of use a cinematic or a literary trick, I guess you could say. If you've read a book or watched a movie where it shows you a scene or describes a scene, and you're just kind of like, oh, okay, wow. It kind of gives you a little bit of information without a whole lot of context. But then the scene changes and it says a few hours earlier, right? You've seen a show like that or a movie where it shows you something that says hours earlier, days earlier. Or in this case, we're a few hours earlier. We're going to read this verse that Mark captures of this incident at the end, because how did we get here? Why is he doing these signs? Again, partly because he's showing himself to be God in the flesh. He's helping his disciples along in their belief. But here's the kind of future-looking preview, and then we'll go a few hours previous. So we'll start in Mark 6:51 and 52. They, the disciples, were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves because their heart was hardened. So let that sink in for a minute, because this is after the feeding of the 5,000. This is after Jesus walks on water. Why did these things take place? What was their mindset? What was their heart orientation in all this? They hadn't fully understood the deeper meaning. Their heart was hardened, spiritually kind of blind to these things. In continuing that motif of John really introduces this idea where he almost forces us to look at the parallels between Moses' backstory and what's happening with John. And he introduces this at the end of John chapter 5, where Jesus says, you should have believed Moses because he's written about me. And then he starts introducing all these concepts and all these terms that just point us directly back to what's going on in Moses. And this hardening of the heart concept is very clear, because this is what Pharaoh did. He hardened his own heart. He wouldn't open his mind and open his heart up to the things that God was clearly showcasing. And ultimately, God hardened his heart for him. And we're going to see that later today. But the disciples, Jesus is working on them and working on them. And you see earlier on in John chapter 2, when he does the miracle at the wedding at Cana, turning the water into wine, the first sign says, this is the beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So you have this fledgling belief. It's strong, it's growing, but he doesn't quite understand the deeper spiritual meaning of, okay, this is the Messiah. We don't quite fully grasp that he's God in the flesh, that he's the Son of God. Right now, their hearts are hardened. They don't understand the loaves. They don't quite understand all the things that are going on. And we're going to get to that today. But another portion from Mark 8 says, Jesus left the disciples, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. And the disciples forgot to take bread and did not have more than one loaf with them. And he charged them, Jesus said, saying, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned amongst themselves, saying, is it because we don't have any bread? But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear? And do you not remember? when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said to him, 12. And also when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets did you take up? And they said, 7. And he said to them, so how is it you do not understand? So this is their mindset, their orientation of their heart. Spiritually, kind of the dimmers are on, and this is where we find ourselves today. Now, a few hours earlier, started in John 6:15. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the sea arose, because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, it is I. Do not be afraid. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. So again, this is a miracle of jurisdiction, of authority. The previous miracle of jurisdiction was, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I created this particular day, this particular tradition of rest. I made it, right? I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I did these things. I'm sovereign over that. But now this is a miracle of jurisdiction and authority and sovereignty, not just over that day, but over everything. This is sovereignty on the sea, but really over all. This chapter starts out in John chapter 6, again, to give you the backstory again. After these things, this is the space between John chapter 5 and John chapter 6. Last week we saw how in between that time are a few months where Jesus sends out the disciples, gives them power to do these things, and then they come back and you have that episode of the feeding of the 5,000. He provides for them miraculously. You have those 12 remaining baskets, and they're just blown away by that. But this is how it starts. There's a great multitude that followed him there, and they followed him because they saw his signs that he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. So you have a lot of people kind of probably migrating from all over the place, but in this case from north to south. They're going to Jerusalem for the Passover. And Jesus goes to kind of reconvene with all of his disciples, talk about what they had just done, and they go up on the mountain together, and they're talking about these things. The miracle happens, and the response is a forceful crowd. Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king. He departed again to the mountain by himself alone. The other Gospels will fill in and say Jesus is the one who dismissed the crowds. He's the one who separated them, and they wanted to take him by force. And what we see from the crowd in verse 15 is that the crowd desired to make Jesus their king, but that Jesus perceived their intentions. And this was a forceful grasping. We want you, our king. Why? Because the signs, because the bread, because of all of the superficial stuff. And this is a violent kind of grabbing. This is the same kind of taking up, caught up, a variation of that word harpazo, from which we get the rapture. This is a taking up, like when Paul writes, somebody was caught up into the third heaven. Caught up, seized, forcefully taken. We who are alive and remain shall be caught up, harpazo, together in the clouds with the Lord, and we'll be with him and meet him in the air. This is a forceful taking. They want to impose their will on Jesus, on their time, and on the things that they want. I want food, I want to be healed, I want a king, a temporal, sure, you're the Messiah. Maybe they even believe that, but they didn't believe big enough. They didn't fully understand, just like his disciples did. This is a temporal thing. We like our bellies filled. This is really good. Who wouldn't want that? You want the superficial needs met, and hey, we're already going down to Jerusalem for Passover, so let's take him. We're going to announce him to be our choice of king there. This is it. This is what they're going to do. And Jesus sees all that. He knows the hearts of men. He knows what they're planning. But isn't this what people do with Jesus today? You presume to know or to have an idea of what you want God to be. We talked about this in true worship, right? You have this idea of who you want God to be and how you want to worship God and how you're going to come to him and who you're going to make him in your life. Scratch all that. Erase that. It's not up to you. God is who he said he is. He wants you to do the things he's told you to do, and you take it or leave it. And these people want to take Jesus and make him their king, and Jesus doesn't want any part of that. He dismisses the disciples, dismisses the crowd, because he understood that maybe the disciples were going to be maybe a little bit drawn in by that. right? Well, hey, that's actually not quite a bad idea. The disciples whose hearts are still a little bit hard and cloudy, that's a pretty good idea. Let's do that. Let's accelerate this process. So we have this scene there. We see parallels. Again, looking back at Moses, John's kind of inviting us to look at this, look back at Moses. In Exodus 32, we see a similar picture of the crowd desiring to make a false god and God fully aware of what their actions are. So you can turn there in your Bibles. It won't be on the screen. I have a head start because of my bookmarks. You're doing sword drills. Who did sword drills when they were growing up? You remember that? I would always try to be lucky and have my finger, like, maybe they'll call on, like, Psalm 89, and, like, every once in a while you'd hit it, right? Like, yes, I got it. All right, the gold calf. We know this episode. When the people saw Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, "Come and make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And Aaron said to them, "Break off the gold earrings which are in the ears of your wives and sons and daughters and bring them to me." And all the people broke off the gold earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, fashioned it with an engraving tool, made a molded calf, and they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." This is the people desiring to make themselves a false god. This is the people desiring to make Jesus something he wasn't there for. But this is what people do. Moses is gone, right? Oh, Jesus is here, but we want to make him something of our own. Jesus is out in the world today, but you know what? This is a Jesus that loves everyone, condemns no one, will save everyone. There's no talk of hell. There's no talk of judgment. There's no talk of repentance. That's the Jesus people want to talk about, right? No, we don't. That's not who Jesus is. That's not who God is. But this is what the people want. This is the mindset of the people. Let's make a God for ourselves. Moses, we don't know what's happened to him. Come on, Aaron, help us out here. Go to verse 7. The Lord said to Moses, "Go and get down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people.'" In the same way, Jesus looks out, he perceives what's going on in the hearts and minds of the people in the crowd, and he's like, I know what their designs are. I know what their motives are. They don't really want me as their savior, spiritual, saving king. They just want me as a temporal king who's going to give them the things that they want. And that's not what I'm here for. But the crowd had designs on this. This is what they wanted, but they didn't see the fuller, better plan that Jesus had. So this is the forceful crowd. And now we go to the fearful disciples. Evening came, the disciples went to the sea, got in the boat towards Capernaum. It's dark, Jesus had not come to them, and then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing, and they rowed about 3 or 4 miles. And you look to Matthew and Mark for additional content here because John doesn't tell us this particular detail, but we see why the disciples left without Jesus, because it would have been natural to think that, well, hey, this crowd's maybe getting worked up into a little bit of a frenzy here. We're definitely not going to leave Jesus alone. But from Mark and Matthew, they have pretty much identical verses here. They both say, immediately he, Jesus, made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitude away. So Jesus is the one saying, get out of here, I'm compelling you. This is strong language. I'm compelling you, I'm constraining you, forcing you, go. I'm going to deal with this, you need to leave. And it could have been, again, because he didn't want them to get wrapped up in the excitement. He didn't want them to be in danger. But ultimately, it's because he's putting them in a position that we're going to see. It's another sort of test. And we saw that the testing is fine because he did that. We talked about it last week in the first part of John 6. He's tested Philip, right? God tests people, and that's okay. So Jesus is the one who made them go. This is why they leave. They weren't trying to ditch Jesus. They probably wanted to stay. The language is that of he had to convince them. He had to make them because they didn't want to depart. But they're on their own, and we see here conditions that are setting them up to have that test, conditions for fearfulness that John describes here in his chapter. And this is important to understand the mindset of what's going on there. We already understand their hearts are hardened a bit, spiritually blind to the truths Jesus is trying to tell them. And so that plays into this, but what are some conditions here that John says? It was dark, first of all. It was already dark. Jesus had not come, John says. They were probably waiting for him to come, and it gets dark, and he's like, well, he's not going to come now, so we're going to go like he told us to. You have the waves coming because the wind was whipping down, and you have exhaustion. They had rowed for 3 or 4 miles, John said. Now, the Sea of Galilee situation, the geography is such a way, the topography is such a way where it was the lowest lying freshwater lake in the world, 600 feet below sea level. You have these mountains and outcrops that are kind of bulged up around them like a big rim. So when wind comes over there, you could have a perfectly normal, placid sea, and then in just a matter of moments, you could have just winds and waves whipping through there, causing a big commotion, which is what happened. Mark here gives us a little bit more detail. They were tormented, painful, tortured is the word that's often used that's translated this when they were straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. They were tormented or tortured. This is a word that's translated in the King James that way. And then it was a prolonged journey. About the 4th watch of the night is when this came to a climax. So they left when it was dark. It's at the 4th watch, which is between 3 and 6 a.m. In what should have been a very short 1-hour journey, they had been rowing for at a minimum 6 hours. At most, you're talking 8 to 9 hours. The 4th watch. So they're they're straining at the rowing. They're trying to remain in control, and it's taken them a lot longer. Matthew here gives us a little bit more context. The boat was now in the middle of the sea. Tossed by the waves, the wind was contrary. So they're completely out of control. This would have been something they would have left on the coast, hugged the coastline, gone up to Capernaum, but now they're in the middle of this sea, which was, again, 5 miles at its largest width, 8 miles by its longest area, but they're in the middle of it now. So they've been blown so far off course, now they're not even close to the coastline, and they're getting tossed by the waves, thrown about. The wind was contrary to them. Look at all these conditions for fearfulness. It's dark. Jesus hasn't come. You're facing opposition. You're tired. You're tortured. It's painful. It's taking longer than you want it to. Things are out of control. You're lost, and it's extremely dangerous conditions. And if that's not a picture of just life in general, I don't know what is, right? Because these are all conditions that set us up, that can test us and test our faith, because life is like that sometimes. Sometimes it's dark. Sometimes it's difficult. Jesus certainly hasn't come yet. You have opposition, winds and waves. You're getting tossed about. It's dangerous. It can feel torturous. It can feel painful. And sometimes, and this is probably the biggest thing for me, things just take longer than you want it to sometimes, doesn't it? You get impatient. And that person that I wanted to get saved, or this trial that I'm going through, it's lasting a whole lot longer than I would have liked it to. This is bearing on my soul, and you get that feeling in the pit of your stomach, wow, this is dangerous, and it's creating a sense of dread in me, this fear that the disciples are saying that they have. And this is what we go through in the Christian life, because this is testing. Why were they there? Jesus sent them there. Jesus compelled them, constrained them, you go. It doesn't seem fair in a way, but we're going to see why this happened later. We see another parallel with this, though, back in Exodus, before Exodus 32. You can go to Exodus 14. Exodus 14, we see some more conditions for fearfulness in the people of Israel when their backs are against the wall at the Red Sea. 14 verse 10, Pharaoh drew near. The opposition drew near. The children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and so they were very afraid. That makes sense, right? Be very afraid of that. You escaped, nobody's on your tail, and then all of a sudden you're at the Red Sea, you have nowhere to go, and you have this army pressing down on you. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. And then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness. I wouldn't be surprised if that was a thought in the minds of the disciples on that boat, in all of these conditions of fearfulness, where it's just like, it would have been better if we just stayed with the crowd and made Jesus our king, because we're going to die out here. We're going to drown. And a lot of these guys are experienced. They've been on the water, but look at all these conditions. They're afraid. Sometimes we think it'd be better for us if we weren't in that particular position, but Moses says to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still. See the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. Stand still. See the salvation. The Lord's going to fight for you. He's going to accomplish it today. Hold fast. Stand still. Be at peace. All these conditions of fearfulness, they're going to pass away at some point. You're going to see the salvation come to fruition at some point. But in the midst of these, in the seasons when we have these conditions for fearfulness that test our faith, that test our commitment, we need to remain faithful. And that fearfulness can be overcome because of the faithfulness of Christ. They saw Jesus, John says, walking on the sea, drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." And then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. So yeah, Jesus did compel them to go. And we see all these things that, again, parallels of Jesus and parallels with Moses. But for the remainder of this, we really John showcases here that Jesus, again, is the greater prophet. He's the greater Moses. He does greater miracles. He's God in the flesh. Jesus is walking on the water, but in Jesus' faithfulness, we see certain things that the authors here point out that we can take comfort in. So when we're fearful, we can understand and know that we have a faithful Christ. And the first thing is that we see that Jesus prayed. Why wasn't Jesus there? Where was he? He sends his disciples away. He dismisses the multitude. And where's Jesus at? He's not goofing around. He's up in the mountain praying. That's what the other gospel writers tell us. He's up there communing with God, just like Moses was up there communing with God. He goes up there with the 70. God calls him up higher. Come up in here. Come see my glory. Moses goes up by himself. And the people, meanwhile, are fearful. Man, where's Moses? We don't know where he's at. What's going on? Well, Jesus prayed. And Jesus still does things for us. He intercedes. It says in Romans, Jesus is now the right hand of God, also interceding for us. 1 John says he is now our advocate with the Father. Hebrews says he always lives to intercede for us. He's working in all the problems. He's working in these conditions that we have that cause fear, that cause dread, that cause anxiety, that give us so much worry and consternation. Why are we in this position? I'm following God. I'm doing the right things. I feel Jesus compelled me to do something and live a certain way, and yet all I have are problems. Why does it feel like he sent me out here to suffer? It's a season, sure, but know that Jesus prayed for his disciples, and he intercedes for us today. I love this bit from Mark. John doesn't tell us this, but Mark does. Jesus saw them. I don't know how this happened, knowing the conditions that were set. Mark 6:48 says, "Then he saw them, straining at rowing, for the wind was against them." Now, maybe Jesus has really good night vision. I don't know. But more than likely, it's just he has that divine sight where he can see, he knows. Jesus knows what you're going through. He constrains you to do a particular thing and live a certain way. He knows the trouble that you're going to have before you even get to it. And he knows what's going on. He sees the straining. He sees the toil. He sees the calluses. He sees the fear that can be built up in you. But know that he sees all that. And it's also comforting to know that we have a Jesus who not only sees and knows, but has experienced. From Hebrews, we don't have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses. Jesus knows these things. He was in all points tempted as we are, but without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. Not only did Jesus see these things, but he knows what's going on and he's personally experienced them. Again, that parallel between Moses and Jesus. Moses is gone up on those mountains, and even in the wilderness, 40 years, gone for 40 days. Jesus had that temptation in the wilderness 40 days and 40 nights. He's been greatly tested, but he hasn't sinned, and he can advocate, and he is that perfect high priest. Jesus came to them in the fourth watch of the night, Matthew tells us. Jesus went to them. They were certainly not going to make it to him in those conditions. The wind being against them, all the opposition, they're exhausted, they've been rowing. They're probably thinking, we can't go anymore. Can you imagine rowing in the dark? The water is a scary place to be when you're in the wind and waves like that, but now you're in the dark, and you know how dark it can be. I mean, if you've been boating or you've been out on a big ship or anything like that, the water can be a scary place even for seasoned fishermen like some of them were. But Jesus came to them. Earlier, John says it almost seemed like they were waiting for him to come while they were in the boat, and then they left without him, and they're just probably wondering, like, what's going to happen? Where's Jesus at? You know, what's going on? Well, he was waiting for the right time. And we also know from this that Jesus is coming again. Acts 1, while the disciples looked steadfastly toward heaven as Jesus went up, 2 men stood by them in white apparel, and he said to them, Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. Jesus is going to come at his appointed time. He's going to come when it's ready. He's going to come when we're going through all these trials, when we're going through all these tribulations, through much persecution, through all these trials, through all these tribulations, the kingdom's going to come. We're not exempt from any of this. I would never use this language, but Paul does, so it's in the Bible. I'm going to use it because I wouldn't want to make light of anybody's affliction. But this is what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, for our light affliction, which is also but for a moment. It's if you tell it somebody who's going through a hard, troubling time, that seems kind of callous and cold. It's just a light affliction. It's just for a moment. It's not what people want to hear. But it's Paul's words, Holy Spirit inspired. But how can you say that to someone, anyone going through affliction or loss? You've lost a loved one. You're in great pain. Because when you compare it to what's on the other end, Paul says our light affliction is just a moment, but it's working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Compared against the eternal weightiness of the glory that awaits, that's why we can consider all the affliction going on momentary and light. And that's hard to jive with us sometimes in our minds. When you're going through it, it feels like you're just being pressed down by a 2-ton weight. I mean, it's hard. It's a struggle. But Jesus intercedes, and Jesus knows, and Jesus is coming again at his appointed time. Now we get to the actual miracle. Jesus walked on the water. What? It's like, as it is with all the other miracles, the curious side of my brain takes over, and I just have all these questions. Was it like a buoyancy thing? Did his feet get wet? Did he slip at all? Like, you have all these questions like, how is he possibly walking on the water, but he can do it? I just have so many questions. John tells us when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, and where are they at? The middle of the Sea of Galilee. They saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat. He's walking on the sea. He's the ones who created and set the sea and the land its limits and did all these things, and he can certainly walk on it. He has authority over all of his creation, not just the Sabbath day, but every day. And that's an important thing to remember, because when we come to worship, we're not just coming to worship on one day of the week. He better be your God the other 6 days of the week, right? That goes back to this making the Jesus or the God who you want it to be. Do we come on Sundays and Wednesdays, and that's our God Sundays and Wednesdays, but all those other gaps, I get to make a God of my own choosing. It's a different God. You better reconsider. He's the same God, the Lord of the Sabbath. He made all these waves and wind and all these other things, and he can certainly walk on the water, and that's just an amazing thing to think about. In Revelation, John is the author of Revelation as well, so I think it's fair to make this connection. Revelation 13, Revelation 17, you have the beast coming out of the sea. In Revelation 17, John tells us that the sea is the people and the multitudes and the kings and all the power, and the beast that's given authority. That's what comes out of the sea. That's just the people. That's the earth. Jesus has authority over all that. He's walking on the sea. Not through it like Moses. The east wind came and blew it aside, and they had a wall of water, and Moses and the people go through that, like we go through our trials and tribulations in this world, but Jesus has authority over all of it. Matthew 28, Jesus came and spoke to them saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And if I need to showcase that, like you saw, by me walking on water, great. But that's just a signifier right there. God in the flesh, the one who spoke it all into existence, he can walk on it too. He has authority over all of it. Isn't that the king that you want in your life? Not as some temporal Messiah, but I mean the person who can do that. Hard to fathom, because when maybe you know somebody who's almost drowned, or maybe you've been almost a victim of drowning, but man, the water can be scary. And to be out, who's actually been out on the ocean so far where you can't see any land? Has anybody been on the ocean so far where you cannot see land? A few of us have been. It's a little daunting. And can you imagine being out there pitch black? The sea, especially in the Bible, but in general, the sea is such a unexplored area. And we had that tragedy of that submarine exploding. I mean, you try to go to these depths. They say that we've explored more of space than we've explored the depths of the ocean. But God knows every nook and cranny of that. And he created all that, and he formed and fashioned all of the things that are in it, places that we can't even go. He controls all of it. He walks on all that, and it's just amazing to think about. But that's the miracle and the more spiritual meaning. He's in charge of it all. Mark says this, he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea and would have passed them by. I think that's an interesting phrase to consider. He would have passed them by. I don't think it was his intention to pass them by. I think it was intention for them to see him. But again, you have allusions to even Elijah, but also Moses here. And when you see God saying, I'm going to pass by you, Moses, I'm going to pass by you, Elijah, it's for demonstration of his power and of his glory. I'm going to pass by, he says to Moses, so I will show you my glory and cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. To Elijah, he says, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Elijah heard it, and he has to pull his cloak over his face, and he's standing there in the mouth of the cave. Earlier in John, back in chapter 1, verse 36, when John the Baptist saw Jesus passing by, he says, look, the Lamb of God. When Jesus or God passes by, it's for you to see his glory, his power, his authority, his goodness, all of these things. And this is what happens. They saw Jesus walking on the sea, drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Well, who else is it going to be, right? They thought, the other Gospels tell us, it's a ghost. And again, you're tired, you're fearful, a little delusional, exhausted, and you see somebody out there walking on the water, and it's an impossibility. Like, who else is it? It's either a ghost or it's God, right? And they're scared. But Job tells us that God alone spreads out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. It's God. Jesus treads on the waves of the sea. Inserted in this miracle, its sovereignty on the sea, is you have that mini episode of this whole miracle of Peter. If it's you, Lord, call me out there, and I'll go walk with you. And to Peter's credit, he does walk on the water. But all those fearful things, those conditions for fearfulness that were set, that hardened heart that was not quite broken up yet, he looks around, and what does he see? He sees the waves, and he gets scared, and he starts sinking, and he says, save me, Lord. Isaiah 41 says, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, and I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And you can almost picture him saying, Peter, grab my righteous right hand. I'm going to pull you up out of that water. And when we're going through all this and we have that blossoming of faith that says, Lord, I'm going to walk on water, I'm going to do that thing that you told me to do, and you start to sink, just look at Jesus. Grab that righteous right hand, the one who prays and intercedes, the one who sees and knows, the one who's coming again, the one who has authority over all. Grab that hand. He's got you. And he tells them, it's I, ego eime in the Greek, I am. The name that God gave to Moses when he says, well, who Who am I going to say sent me, right? Tell him that I am who I am. In the Greek Septuagint, that's what he says, ego eimi. And Jesus says to them, I am. That's kind of the direct translation, don't be afraid. The ultimate kind of self-existent, doesn't derive from anything else, gets power from nowhere else. It's me. Don't be afraid. And if you have the I am telling you that, don't be afraid. And you do have the I am telling you that. So in all these conditions of fearfulness, don't fear. Take heart. Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, Mark tells us. And this is, we've met now, right? We had our preview at the beginning of this lesson, and we went a few hours earlier. We've caught up in our time. We're reading Mark 6:51 again. They were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. But Matthew tells us this additionally. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Yes, good. In all that fearfulness and anxiety and dread and the opposition and the fear that they had been dealing with on this, they came through on the other side with a greater realization of who God is, and that is good. When we're going through all that stuff in our lives, and you're feeling beat down, and this journey's taking longer than you wanted to, and you just have this anxiety, fear, and dread about whatever it is, you want somebody to be saved, you're dealing with an issue. If you come through on the other side because you're looking at Christ, you're looking at God, and you have a better understanding of who he is, that's good. Isn't that the point? Don't you have a better understanding of who God is today than you did when you first got saved? And you probably wouldn't want to have it any other way, right? And hopefully you have a better understanding of who God is today than you did a year ago. And if it's not growing, there's probably an issue there. We want to come through on all of these trials and all these tests of faith to have a better understanding like these disciples did. Truly, you are the Son of God. After the wedding in Cana, they believed. They knew he was the Messiah, so they followed him, but their hearts were hardened, and now you see that kind of cracking, and it's going to open up, and they're spiritually going to be enlightened even more and more. Psalms 107, interestingly, has these few verses, and after what we've read today, you'll immediately see the parallels, and it's almost like this was written as a poem about this incident, and I love that about the Bible. Psalm 107:25. For he commands and raises the stormy wind, which lifts up the waves of the sea. They mount up to the heavens, they go down again to the depths, and their soul melts because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man and are at their wits' end. All these conditions of fearfulness that this psalm just pushes right there in front of us. You're staggering, you're at their wits' end, you're toiling. Painstakingly, one version says, you're in trouble, the winds and the waves are whipped up, and you're just worried. And this is what we saw in the first part of the gospel today that we read. Then they cry out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brings them out of their distresses. He calms the storm so that its waves are still. Then they are glad because they are quiet, and so he guides them to their desired haven. John uses the language of Jesus is in the boat and they receive him willingly. Not like the forceful crowd. They weren't going to take him and seize him and say, you're our king now, you're going to give us what we want. No. Jesus is out there, they're willingly receiving him. It's kind of the idea of they're in faith, they're believing him, receiving him into that boat. That's the way Jesus wants to be received, for who he is. Passing by, you see him for who he is, please come into there. Please come into my boat, please come into my life and make that change. And then John gives that language. Once they had willingly received him into the boat, immediately they were at their destination. I don't think that's meant to imply a miracle necessarily, but more of just compared to what they had just gone through. The hours of painstaking rowing and all the fear compared to the very short trip once Jesus got in the boat. Everything's calm, everything's better. They get to their destination. And that's just going to happen when Jesus comes back. All the stuff that worries us now, gone. We're with him. When he comes back and snatches us up forcefully, we're with him immediately at our destination. Trouble's over. He guides us to our desired haven. So a lot there in a little bit of time, but wow, it's an incredible passage. Walking on the water, sovereignty on the sea, and we'll cover some of the more the rest of John 6 as we get into it next week. So any comments, insights today? All right, just pray. Jerry, would you mind closing for us today?